This is the Unit 1 overview video. I'm going to be making these videos for each unit. I'll be going over some of the more important concepts and some of the things that might be confusing as you go through the content in the textbook and on iLearn. But I won't be able to cover everything in these videos. It should just be a kind of a synopsis. So you definitely still need to be doing all of your reading and watching all the videos on iLearn. So we'll start off with chapter 1, and the first concept is going to be the nature versus nurture. So the idea behind this is that there's these two forces that kind of shape human beings and help us become who we are. So nature would be things like our DNA and just genetically the biological factors that we were born with. And then nurture are the things that come from the environment. So these would be things like where you live, your family structure, parenting style, socioeconomic status, things like that. So the basic idea behind this is that there's always been this debate in developmentalism about which is more influential. Is it your genes or is it how you're raised? And the basic understanding that we've come to as we've studied this over the years is that they both are equal influences and that they really interact with each other. And you really can't have one without the other. So even just your basic DNA is affected by the environment. And so we influence the environment, it influences us. It's just this give and take that they both really influence a lot. So the next is Bronfenbrenner's ecological system. So this is basically just the idea that there's all these different levels of influence on a person. So it starts off on the smallest level as a microsystem. That's something like your family. Then it goes out to the next level, which is exosystem. So this would be something like a workplace, social structures, things like that. For a child, their parents' workplace would be an exosystem because it doesn't really directly influence the child. They're not the ones going to work every day, but the things that happen with their parents' employment will definitely influence them just in an indirect way. So then the next level is the macrosystem. That is the biggest one. So that would be something like the country that you live in, or your religion or something like that. Things that are more cultural, like the media, that would be a macro system. And then chronosystem is the difference over time. So this would look at something like the differences of growing up during the Great Depression versus growing up now in the technology age. And then finally, mesosystem isn't really a system by itself. It means that two of the other systems are interacting. So if like a parent-teacher conference, for example, would be a mesosystem because two systems, the parents and the school teacher classroom, are interacting. So just two systems interacting with each other. Okay, now something that a lot of people get confused about, these next two topics, the difference between the scientific method and research method. So some of your questions that you'll need to be answering will ask you, like, what is the method? And it's not very clear about what it's asking about. So in those questions, it's most likely going to be asking about research method. It wants to know how the researcher did their experiment or their study, basically. So that's different from scientific method. So I'll talk about scientific method first, and then I'll explain the different research methods. So a scientific method is just the steps that we would go through when we're studying something. So you would apply the scientific method on any of the research methods. It's just the order that you go through. So it starts off with a curiosity or a question. Then you develop a hypothesis, which is a prediction. So a hypothesis is not a question. That's the first step. So the second step is, now I'm going to guess what I think the answer to that question is going to be. So your hypothesis needs to be a statement, not a question. So you're saying, I guess that this is how my experiment is going to turn out. Then next is the testing, where you're actually gathering the data and figuring out what does what, and then you draw your conclusions from the data that you get. So was my hypothesis correct or was it not? and then you report your results. So those steps are scientific methods. Okay, then research methods, which is usually what the question wants to know on these assignments. What research method did someone use when they were studying something? So it's going to be one of these three. It's either observation, experiment, or survey. So the difference between an observation and an experiment is just how much the researcher is interfering. So in an observation, the researcher is not interfering at all. It's the least obtrusive. So basically, they're just going to sit and watch, and they'll take notes and they'll write down things, but they're not going to change anything. So it can be in a lab where you're just watching kids play or something like that, but you're not introducing any variables at all. Or it could be out in the naturalistic kind of in their own environment type of setting. That would be an observation. If you see anything about the researcher does one treatment to one group and then a different treatment to another group, that's not an observation because the researcher is interfering. That would be an experiment. So an experiment is, I have two different groups. I'm going to do one thing to this group, something different to this other group. I'm going to see what the differences are. That's an experiment. And then the last one is survey. That's just basically like a questionnaire. You'll be asking what was your opinion on something, or what was your experience, things like that. Okay, so those are the three methods. And then you have different ways that you can go about doing each of these methods. So you could have cross-sectional, longitudinal, or cross-sequential. So those three things are not methods by themselves. They're ways that you could do one of the other methods. So you could have a cross-sectional experiment, or you could have a longitudinal observation. So just keep in mind when you're answering a question about what was the method, it's going to have to be one of those three: observation, experiment, or survey. So cross-sectional is just done one time. It compares two different groups of people. So say you want to study elementary school children. You want to see the differences between kindergarten and 5th grade. So in a cross-sectional design, you would take a kindergarten class and a 5th grade class, and you would just combine them and study them all at once. So it's just done one time. But longitudinal would be where you take the kindergarten class and you study them during kindergarten, and then you come back and study them every year up until 5th grade. So you're studying the same group of kids over a long period of time. And this is like years. If they came back the next day, that wouldn't be longitudinal. It's like over a long period of time. Cross-sequential actually uses both cross-sectional and longitudinal, so it kind of has the benefit of both. So it would take two groups, but it would be comparing them just like a cross-sectional would, but then they do it back over time. So then they'll come back a year later and study those two groups again. So you can see the differences of how each group changes over time. So that's really the most beneficial to get the best results, would be cross-sequential. And then your data can either be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative just means it has a number attached to it, and qualitative would be something that you cannot attach a number to, like someone's opinion or something like that. Okay, so when you have an experiment, we're going to go back to experiment for a minute, you're going to have variables. So I want to talk about variables because this can get kind of confusing. So a variable is anything that can influence the outcome of your research. It can be something that you're not doing on purpose, something that just sort of happens and you didn't control for that variable. But the ones we want to talk about are the independent and the dependent variable. So I'm going to use the example of this classic experiment that was done. A third grade teacher back in the 1960s named Miss Elliott, Jane Elliott, took her group of students and she wanted to test how they would handle racism or discrimination, things like that. This is back in the 60s during the civil rights movement. So she told one group, so she based them on eye color. She told the blue-eyed kids that they were better and smarter, and the blue-eyed kids got more privileges. They got more recess time. She made the brown-eyed kids wear collars. The brown-eyed kids got fewer minutes at recess. She told everybody that the brown-eyed kids were stupid, things like that. So she divided her class into groups based on eye color. Okay, so in this experiment, the independent variable is the thing that is being changed. It's what they're trying to figure out, is that going to affect anything? So the eye color grouping is the independent variable in this case, and the things that go with it. So things like the blue-eyed kids got extra recess time. That is part of the independent variable because that's what the researcher is changing. Her telling the kids that brown-eyed kids are stupid and the blue-eyed kids are smart. That's part of the independent variable because she's changing that variable based on which group you're in. So all the brown-eyed kids have to wear a collar to designate that you have brown eyes. That's part of the independent variable. Okay, then the dependent variable is the thing that might change as a result of what you did. So based on which treatment you got, what's going to happen. That's part of the dependent variable. And the way I remember this is that the dependent variable depends on which independent variable you got. So this would be things like how the children were treating each other, or how long it took them to do their homework assignments, or, just it's sort of like the result, but the result is the recorded change. So the dependent variable is things like the brown-eyed kids were crying more often than the blue-eyed kids were, so that would be, the result would be the amount, but the actual reaction, that's part of the dependent variable. So it gets a little confusing because the dependent variable kind of seems like it goes with the result, which it does. But just remember that the independent variable is the thing that is changed, the treatment that's being given to each group, and then the dependent variable depends on which group you're in. It's kind of like the result. Okay. So in chapter 2, we're going to go into all the different theories. So theories are really important in child development. This is something that we're going to be coming back to for the entire semester. So these basic theories, it's really important for you to understand the differences between them, to understand which person said what, and things like that. If we were in class together, I would spend an entire class period on each one of these theories. But I'm trying to make this video short and sweet, so I'm not going to do that here. But I have posted a lot more specific videos that explain each of these theories on the announcement for Unit 1. So make sure to watch each of those videos so that you can understand all of the different theories. Okay, so a theory is basically just an idea. Somebody comes up with an idea or a possible explanation of something. So these theories are about child development. So somebody says, I think children develop in this way and this is why, and things like that. So it's not to say that one theory is 100% right or another theory is 100% wrong. It's really just someone's idea about what they think happens. So we can get a lot of good information from these theories. Some of them make more sense than others. There are good parts about each one. Some of them have bad parts that people don't agree with, and that's fine. You don't have to agree with the theory, but you do need to know the theories and understand what each person said. So one of the ones that people usually don't really like or don't really agree with is Freud, and he falls under the psychoanalytic umbrella. So for psychoanalytic, you've got Freud and Erikson. Freud was focusing a lot on sexual drives and things like that, which is why people don't really like to think in child development terms in that way. But he did have some interesting ideas that can help us kind of understand development if we can kind of just take what he said and use it in a more normal kind of way. He actually had some pretty good ideas. So then Erikson goes along with Freud. He was a follower of Freud's, but he focused more on the social aspect, and he has these two opposing forces for each stage. So that's psychoanalytic. Then we've got behaviorism. So behaviorism is very much environmental. This is Watson, Skinner, and Pavlov. They thought that development was based purely on the environment, and you could train somebody to be any way you wanted them to be, that their genes did not matter, that they were a blank slate, basically, and you could mold them however you wanted them to be. So it's all about the conditioning and the rewards and punishments and things like that. Then on the opposite end of that spectrum would be Piaget and the cognitive theorists. So basically, cognitive development and these Piaget stages. It's all about brain development and just the way the brain and the body mature over time. So it's very much a nature kind of theory. And he's got these stages of brain development. And we're going to be talking about each of these stages as we go through every unit for the entire semester. So these are important for you to understand. We're going to be going back to Piaget quite often during the whole semester. And he's our brain development cognitive guy. Then we have sociocultural, which is Vygotsky. And he focused a lot on the social environment when it comes to learning. So he was all about social learning and having a mentor and how we teach each other and how the best learning happens when people are interacting and it's not always necessarily a classroom with a textbook, but real world experiences. And then we have the universal theories, which would include Maslow. And basically the universal theories say kind of we all have these basic human needs and we're all more alike than we are different. And these basic human needs need to be met before we can really move on to the next stages of development. So you'll see a video about Maslow's hierarchy and it'll explain the different levels. So again, just please watch those theory videos so that you can get a whole lot more detail about each one of these different categories. Chapter 3 is about genetics and how different DNA works and how different genes are expressed and things like that. So there's a question that wants you to put these different little items in order from smallest to largest. This kind of is a confusing question, so I'm going to explain it here. I don't really expect you to be able to get it straight out of the textbook because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I'll explain why. So the smallest is the DNA molecule, and that's what the genes are made up of. So obviously DNA is smaller than a gene. Then the next one is allele, and that is actually a variation of a gene. So an allele is a gene. So that's why that's confusing, is because those are kind of on the same level. There's not really one that's bigger or smaller. So then the chromosomes are after that. So the genes are what make up the chromosomes. So chromosomes are bigger than the DNA molecules and the genes. And the chromosomes are then stored on the nucleus. So that one comes next in the order. And the nucleus is inside the cell. The nucleus is that center part of the cell. So we know that a nucleus has to be smaller than a cell. So that makes sense. Where it gets a little confusing is the gamete, and the zygote, and the cell. Because a zygote is a type of cell. So those are kind of on the same level. A zygote is the combination of two gametes. So we know that a gamete is smaller than a zygote. So a gamete is a reproductive cell, but it's half the size of a normal cell because these two gametes have to combine to make the zygote. So you have half coming from mom, half coming from dad, and that's when the zygote comes together. But a zygote is a cell. It's a type of cell. And then finally we have the genome, which is the big total, all the instructions, all the genetic information on a human being. So that's going to be the biggest one. So when you get to that question, just do your best with the information that's in the textbook. If you don't get it exactly right, it's not that big of a deal. Just try your best on that question. I'm not going to be taking points off if you get, the gene in the allele or the zygote in the cell. Those aren't, that big of a deal. Okay, then epigenetics is a really interesting field of study. The idea behind epigenetics is that kind of back to the nature versus nurture thing, how the environment affects our genes. So it's not really as clear-cut as was once thought in the scientific world. You have your DNA instructions, and you would, we used to think that that was it. That's what made up, your human being, but it's not necessarily true because the environment influences those genes and how they're expressed. So I'll give you the example of alcoholism because this is in one of your questions as well. So some people have a DNA predisposition to be alcoholic, just the way that their body metabolizes it. It's just, they have that more of an addictive pull than other people, and that's on their DNA. That's part of their genes. But the environmental factor that comes in is Are they ever around alcohol? Do they ever try a drink of alcohol? Things like that. So you could be born with the DNA to make you an alcoholic, but if you never take that first drink, then you will not be an alcoholic. So that's this combination of the environment affecting the genes. So there are certain things in the environment that have to happen to switch on or off certain genes. And if that doesn't or does happen, then that changes the way that the DNA is expressed. And that's the idea of the genotype and the phenotype. So the genotype is just the actual DNA pattern that's written on your chromosomes. The phenotype is what actually expresses in the person. So the physical characteristics. So you have this certain DNA sequence that tells you what your hair color is going to be, and then the phenotype is the actual hair color that happens when the person is born. So genotype and phenotype are always working together. The environment and the genes are always influencing each other. There are these 3 gene patterns that you need to know: additive, dominant recessive, and X-linked. Additive means they are combined. So that would be something like hair color. If mom has black hair, dad has blonde hair, and then baby has somewhere in between a medium kind of brownish hair, that's additive because the 2 genes kind of mush together to make somewhere in the middle. Dominant recessive doesn't work like that. It's either one or the other. So this would be eye color, like you either have brown eyes or you either have blue eyes, and there's not anything in between. And then X-linked are things like color blindness, and that is when it's carried by the mother because it's on the X chromosome, and it's passed down to the sons because they have a Y. So where the mom's X comes onto the son's Y, there's nothing on the Y to counteract that. And so those X-linked traits are really common to be passed down from mothers to sons. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about gene disorders. The textbook gives a lot of good information about things like Down syndrome, which is also trisomy 21, Huntington disease, things like that. There is a question that asks the common characteristics about all this long list of gene disorders, and can you be tested if you are a carrier, things like that. This new version of the textbook doesn't quite have all the information that you need to answer that question. So please be aware when you're trying to answer that question, you might need to look on Google, kind of try to find a good scientific website that might explain those different gene disorders. If you can't quite get everything that you need out of the textbook, it's fine to look at other sources, as long as you're making sure that it's a good, reliable scientific source. So don't stress out too much about that one, though. I'm not going to be grading it super critically. You know, if you can't find something about one of the disorders, it's not a big deal. Just do your best on that question. And then there's a few questions about genetic testing and counseling. So genetic testing is kind of controversial. There's definitely pros and cons to it. When you're answering these types of questions, I just want you to really explain both points of view. That there are good things about genetic testing, but there can also be downsides to it as well, and it kind of depends on what you're testing for. There are some things that are great to get tested for because there's preventable things that you can do to kind of help, your chances, make the condition be better. Other things, it's like you probably shouldn't even test for that because there's nothing you can do about it, things like that. So just definitely read through all the information on both sides of that, pros, cons for genetic testing. The one thing I would recommend if you are saying pros for genetic testing is that genetic counseling should always go with genetic testing, because genetic counselors are trained to be able to give people an informed, decision. So they can kind of take the results that you would get from the testing and explain what it all means and what your odds are and what the risks are and things like that. So if you're going to be getting genetic testing, genetic counseling should definitely go with that to help you understand what the results mean and to make informed decisions. So just make sure to kind of look at both sides of that controversial topic. Then I'm just going to breeze over Chapter 4. It's all pretty self-explanatory. Chapter 4 is really amazing. It's a lot of really cool information about prenatal development, how the fetus actually develops in the womb. See some really cool videos about all the different little processes that happen and what they look like, and it really, truly amazing during those 9 months of pregnancy. Also some tips on how to have healthy pregnancy, some of the dangers that can happen during pregnancy, things to avoid, nutritional things like that. And then there are some birth videos which are optional. I would recommend watching them. It's nothing inappropriate about them. It's just showing a live birth. We're looking at it from a really educational point of view. So, but I can understand if you don't feel comfortable watching that. So definitely your choice on the birth videos. Okay, so that's it for Unit 1. Again, please make sure to read everything and watch your iLearn videos, and let me know if you have any questions.